Welcome to Scoop and Scale, where we dish up the science and weigh facts about mostly equine nutrition. I'm Jill Jackson, lifelong equestrian, podcast producer, and owner of 3 ponies. I'm a dressage rider and at-home horse keeper, living the challenge of managing 3 easy keepers on multiple acres of Iowa pasture.
And I'm equine nutrition consultant, Dr. Claire Tunis of Clarity Equine Nutrition. I develop diet plans for horses ranging from metabolic seniors to Olympic athletes. I also consult for equine nutrition companies. I'm a scientist, dressage rider, and pony club mom.
Claire and I have been horse friends for almost 20 years, and we've been collaborating on this podcast for the past year. And like most good horse friends, we're always talking horses. We're always talking about the challenges of managing our horses, our riding struggles, feeding horses, and what's going on in the wider equine community. This podcast is a place for us to have conversations mostly about equine nutrition. It's for anyone who wants to make better choices when it comes to feeding their horses.
And before we get started, a quick disclaimer. The information in this podcast is general and not meant to replace the individualized advice of your own qualified equine nutritionist or veterinarian. And while I have a PhD in nutrition, I'm not a veterinarian and can't give medical advice.
Thank you for joining us and hope you enjoy the following episode. Much of the country has been plunged into extreme winter cold this past week. Even Florida, which doesn't normally see a lot of truly cold weather, has been below freezing.
Yes, we're riding right around freezing right now here in Arizona for our nighttime low, which I realize will make you scoff. Right around freezing, I hear you say.
I feel like since before Christmas, it's been about -5 every morning when I've gone out to do chores.
Yeah, no thanks. But 32 is cold for us when you think, in the summer we're up over 110 degrees. So the difference between those two is a massive difference. It's all relative, I keep telling myself.
Well, this past week, there's been a lot of people asking for suggestions on social media about how to handle different cold weather problems, and owners concerned about how to take care of their horses in this unusually cold weather. And regardless of where people live, we thought we would chat about some cold weather tips and tricks. There's always a new horse owner or people who have had horses for a long time but have never had to deal with extreme cold.
That's true. If I came and moved my horse to where you live in Iowa, I would be completely lost. I'd have no idea what to do. I'd have to talk to you even more than I do already. So when I think about cold weather, the first thing that comes to my mind is always water and how we're going to get the horses water. I always feel like, for me, it's like if the water's frozen, it's cold. So at least in relatively temperate places I've lived. And obviously water's really important, vital for life. And horses that don't drink enough water are prone to colic. So, not drinking enough water gets pretty scary pretty quickly as a horse owner. And growing up in the southwest of England, where we would get, it doesn't get super duper cold there, but we'd get, a layer of ice on our water buckets. We would do some things that probably in your world are really cute, like putting tennis balls in the water troughs to stop them freezing, and wrapping hay or straw around buckets to help stop them freezing. And I appreciate that doesn't really work when you live in Iowa and other really cold places. So if you're really going to go down super duper cold like you to like -5, how are you keeping horses in front of your water right now?
Not horses. How am I keeping water in front of my horses right now?
Oh, yeah, even that, yes.
That's true. Yes, I think it's cute about the tennis balls, and that's something that I have seen on social media. And in somewhere like Arizona, it might work. Or in Texas, where they're getting cold right now, it might work if it's not going to get super cold and your water's not going to freeze solid. I'm fortunate enough that my barn has electricity. And I have heated tubs out in the pasture, and I have heated buckets in my stall. And I understand that this is not the case for everybody. Growing up in Canada, our horses lived outside all winter. I mean, it got down to -50, and our horses were outside.
Whoa.
And I didn't have a blanket my horse never had a blanket when I was a kid. I don't think any of the horses had a blanket. They were outside in the snow, and we didn't have electricity. And
it was uphill both ways.
It wasn't. I actually boarded my horse when I was a child, and but we did have to take water out, and we didn't keep the water trough filled. We took them buckets of water and we lined them up and filled them and they drank, and we filled them and they drank. And, that's at negative 50. If you don't have electricity, you're not going to do anything to keep that water.
No. Doesn't matter how many tennis balls you put in the bucket.
No. But keeping water available, it is a challenge. And now with technology and some very clever people, there's a lot of actually really good ideas that people have that are tried and tested, and they work. And one of those is a solar aerator air pump. So these are what you put in fish tanks, or if you had like a small pond at your front door.
Yeah, like a bubbler thing.
It's like a bubbler. It's a little bit bigger. You can get these on Amazon, and they're solar powered and keeping that water moving. So again, with your tennis balls, that's the idea, that the water would keep moving. This is actually moving the water from the bottom, pushing the bubbles up. So if you have a big trough, it is not going to keep the whole trough open, but it is going to keep a pretty good circle, enough that the horses can get their noses in and get a drink. So
yeah, I've seen your pond, like I've seen your fish pond, pictures of your fish pond, like frozen out to where you have your aerator, and then like there's just completely open water. Yeah.
Correct. So that's, one good option. Again, you can order those on Amazon. They're solar. It's pretty easy. You drop them in the tank. If you're in a situation that you don't have electricity, that's an option for you. Yeah. Another option is to insulate around your trough. And some people would make a wood box and drop the trough in it and then put straw, or you can put insulation boards around between the trough and the box.
Yeah, styrofoam. We've done that before with big pieces of styrofoam.
Right. So you could do that, and that would also, same thing. If it gets really cold, you might get some ice on the top, but you're not going to be out there with a pickaxe, taking 6 inches of ice off the top of your trough every morning.
Yeah, because I think, so for people like me that have never lived anywhere super cold, I think it's worth just sharing that we're talking about like where you are in like Canada and places, like ice that is like inches thick, right?
That's
this
correct.
is not just tap it with your hammer and it breaks kind of thing. This is like you said, pickaxe.
Yeah, you're going to take an axe out there and you're going to be breaking ice. And if you have to do that, and some people do have to do that, you're only making a small hole, again, just enough so the horses can get their noses into that water, and the rest of the trough has got 6 inch thick ice on it.
Wow.
You can also order insulator bags you can get them on Amazon, you can get them on other places. This is just think of like a pillowcase that you put around your water trough. It's got a drawstring at the top. So you set the trough in it, again, putting straw or hay, any type of insulation in the bag between the trough and the bag, and filling it up, tightening it. Some people will use like duct tape to seal around the top of it. Same thing, those insulator bags, people have really good luck with them. So
that's cool.
Those are pretty easy options, I think. And again, when it's -5, -15, you're still going to get a little bit of ice on the top. But sometimes the horses, like if it's thin enough, they can just push their noses on it. It's a little bit more like Arizona ice that they can break it up.
Right, right. What about in stalls? What do you do in your stalls?
I, again, have electricity in my stalls, so I'm very fortunate that I have heated buckets. But lots of people use milk crates, and they mount them to the wall. And they set the bucket in there, and once again, put straw and hay, to insulate it all around it. And, because if you set it on the ground, we all have that horse that's going to just knock it over. So a lot of people just attach them and then take them down in the spring when they're not using them anymore. But you can also buy the same type of a bag, an insulator bag that goes around your buckets. And I saw that they just used the grocery bag, the freezer grocery bags that you take.
To put your frozen peas in to take them home kind of thing.
Right.
Ice cream.
Somebody just used that, and they just pulled it up and they put their water bucket in, and they said it worked. So, there's lots of options out there. Is it going to be perfect? No. But, we're all doing our best. And hopefully, unless you're living in the north, you're not going to have to deal with this for a prolonged period. But good to have options available to you that that you can go and grab something and be able to try to keep that water unfrozen.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's worth mentioning a quick caution statement about the bucket warmers because I feel like every year I see a post. I actually saw one on a vet forum just recently. Someone posted something about their horse wouldn't drink. It kept going to the water, kept looking at the water, kept wandering off and coming back, and they were really worried about it. And it turned out they had a bucket water that wasn't grounded, a bucket heater that wasn't grounded properly. And so the horse was actually getting shocked when it tried to drink. And, sometimes it can be fine at the beginning of the winter and then something changes and it doesn't ground properly later. And I think it is worth, you do need to check these heaters and things to make sure you're not accidentally giving your horse an electric shock when they're drinking.
Not even just the shock. So every time I go out, I put my hand in the trough and I put my hand in the water buckets. The electric buckets do have a shutoff. So every day I unplug and plug them back in. Like if you put your hand in there, there's a lot of time that the water's cold. So I always check mine, like at night check. I feel it, even if it's warm, I unplug it and plug it back in because I think it just like the heater gets to a certain temp and it shuts off as a safety.
Okay.
So the water never freezes in the barn, but it is important that you stick your hand in because if you put your hand in and get shocked, your horse certainly is not going to put their nose in there.
Right. And it is a fire risk. I mean, it was years ago now, but I saw a picture of one of those massive, really big field Rubbermaid plastic tubs. It completely melted. Like the thing had like some kind of, cross wires or something, caught fire. And I mean, I think we all live in fear of barn fires, right? So that'd be like an absolute nightmare that your bucket warmer somehow had some kind of short and melted your bucket and then caused a fire. So definitely anytime you have water and electricity together, it's, or anything running unsupervised, it's electric in your barn, make sure that the wiring's good and ideally 3-pin grounded plugs and that kind of thing, for sure.
You wrote an interesting article for The Horse about horses' water preference based on temperature. And it was surprising to me that you said they preferred cold water.
Yeah, that was an interesting study that was done at the University of Pennsylvania. So there have been a couple of little studies about sort of horses' behavioral preferences around water temperature done at the University of Pennsylvania. So they did one where they showed that heating water continuously versus providing ambient near freezing water actually increased a horse's water consumption by 41%. They also noted a similar result when they warmed the water and they provided it twice a day versus continuously. And so the what you're speaking to, where I sort of alluded to the fact that the horses preferred cold water, was where what they did was that they during cold weather, they found that if they only have warm water available, they will drink a greater volume per day than if they only have icy cold water available. But if you're going out and you're giving them a choice between warm and icy water at the same time, for some reason, they almost exclusively drank the icy water, and then they drank less volume than if they only had warm water available. So it's actually better to have warm water available, but, and if you're going to have two available at one time, they're going to potentially choose to drink the cold water and not as much. So it's easy to kind of misinterpret that study, but they do prefer warmed water. And if you're going to provide, both together, ideally you don't provide both together, because if you provide them a bucket of warmed water and a bucket of cold water, they're likely going to go drink the cold water and then not drink as much, versus if you just presented them with a bucket of warmed water.
So I don't use my hose in the winter. I only have 2 horses, so I just use buckets to fill the trough and to fill their stall buckets.
Yeah.
And I find that interesting. So I go fill up the bucket and I'll open the stall door and he'll come over and start drinking the cold water. And he's got hot water in his bucket that's plugged in. And yet every time when I walk over with that cold bucket, he always takes a drink out of it. And I'm like, why would you prefer that? I mean, it's it's cold. It's
I don't remember if they had a hypothesis as to, why they preferred the colder water. The other thing that's also worth noting about sort of behavior around drinking is that horses typically, drink fairly soon after eating.
Right.
So if you're going to go wandering out with, taking water out to them and offering them water, doing it, an hour or two after they've eaten, especially if they've eaten hay, they're going to be more likely to want to drink in that moment than at other times. And partly that's because when they're drinking dry hay, they kind of want to hydrate their digestive tracts, and we know that eating hay stimulates thirst and a desire to drink. So you'll get the most water consumption if you're going out and offering sort of discreet, here's a bucket of water to drink, and you're not going to have any more for 6 more hours until I come back, kind of thing. Doing that, a couple hours after feeding hay, they're likely going to drink more water. Obviously, if you have continuous water available, that's less of a concern. But, in some of these places where, you are having to actually take water to them, or they only have a water available right when you've cracked the water on your water trough until it refreezes, doing that at that point in time is going to result in the greatest water consumption potentially. So just food for thought. So have you ever had to carry water from the house to the barn?
Not here, but when I lived in Colorado.
Sounds like a miserable job.
Guess it depends how far the house is to the barn, right?
Good point.
But even just sloshing the buckets now, I mean, I have all the gear. But if you came and you visited and you had to do this, you wouldn't have all the winter gear that I have. And so sloshing the water, getting it on your shoe, getting your glove wet, getting it, lots of times it'll like splash up and hit your leg. No, but that's like a whole, if you have to carry it from the house to the barn, I feel for you. I know that it's a challenge.
Well, I have a little hack potentially for people that do have to do that, because I have a friend who lives in Texas, Kathy Hoyser, and there was a big ice storm that came through, and they have cattle and horses, and were having to take quite a lot of water from the house out and putting it in trucks, right? And, it's annoying because you have to fill the bucket only half full so it doesn't slop, and then you're driving super slowly and hoping that you don't hit a bump and all those good fun things. So she came up with this idea where she actually took a 5-gallon bucket and then would put a trash bag inside of it and fill the trash bag with water, and then tie the trash bag closed, below the top of the bucket. But now you kind of have a bag of water that's contained in a bucket, so it's got structure because it's in a bucket, but it won't slosh because the bag is closed. And I just thought, I thought it was quite clever.
Yeah. Yay, Kathy. Smart idea. I like it.
Right?
Don't use scented garbage bags.
That's a really good point. I hadn't thought about that, but then your horse probably wouldn't want to drink it. Yes, don't buy any of those fancy garbage bags. Just good old boring black bag. I probably would do black bags too, because they are a little bit more robust.
The contractor bags, yes.
Yeah.
Let's talk about tea. You're British.
I love tea.
I know, and you love tea. So I see lots of people making horse tea to get them to drink, and I've never done this. It looks like they're just taking like a couple handfuls of grain or hay pellets and putting them in a bucket of water and then filling the bucket with water. Like, have you done this? Have you seen this? And what do you think of it?
I have. There's actually some products out there that you can purchase that are designed specifically for this. I think they're still around, a company called Horse Quencher. And they had a couple of different flavors, one of which was root beer. I believe that was actually fairly popular. I couldn't say. But so little sachets that you kind of put in the water bucket. But a lot of people use sweet feed, right? They'll take a handful of, some sort of textured feed, something that's yummy, and put it in the water. And it just kind of makes it more interesting, makes it taste yummy, makes it, it's kind of novel. Just use a handful of your horse's normal feed. But obviously you do need to occasionally throw that, make sure you're cleaning your buckets and, throwing it out. You don't end up with a bucket full of sludge kind of thing if they're not drinking it all the way through, because then it ceases to be tea and it becomes something else.
Yeah. So this one's my favorite. I love when I see feed a hot bran mash.
Oh, okay. Yeah. They just won't die. Bran mashes just won't go away.
Rule number 3 of feeding horses. Make changes to feed slowly and over time. So how does feeding a bran mash fit into that rule? Like, I never feed my horse a bran mash. And now there's like all this really cold weather coming in. There's a really high potential for colic and dehydration. And I'm going to go make a huge sloppy mash that my horse has not eaten ever and give it to him? Like, how does anybody think that that's a good idea? What's the better option?
We did it for years and years. I mean, it used to be standard practice, right? That on what, of a Saturday night, all the cab horses and plow horses got a bran mash before their night off. I mean, it was standard practice.
They did get it every week.
Well, yeah, it's still a little bit, that is true, but it's still 7 days is a little far apart. I mean,
it's a little bit more common.
It is. And I mean, so for those who've never made a bran mash, I grew up giving bran mashes. I mean, for as much as you're, being anti-bran mash, I'm guessing you probably gave them when you were a kid. They were very, very popular. And like we would give them to the horses when we got back from hunting. Like the fox hunters always got bran mashes when we got back. So you're basically just taking bran, boiling a kettle, pouring boiling water on it, put it in the bucket, we used to throw like an old feed sack over the top and let it sit for 10, 15 minutes, throw some, salt in there as well and feed it. And it's just this lovely steaming, warm thing that, when you've been out all afternoon and your fingers are freezing, it just feels really good to you. And I will say they are very palatable. Horses really like bran mashes. They are very enticing. But yes, to your point, reason, and they get given not just for the hydration, but also as a laxative to help horses' digestive tracts move. The reason they are effective as a laxative is because you have upset the bacterial population and they're all going, what the heck is this nonsense you just gave me? Like, get it out of here. So yes, that is, yeah.
Can you repeat that part for the people in the back?
Yes, it is a laxative because we have upset the hindgut bacteria. And to your point, we have rule number 3 that, all my little pony clubbers that I teach know that you should make feeding changes gradually over 7 to 10 days. So suddenly giving a horse a bran mash is not a good idea. So, but we all like to make our horses, we like to feel better by giving our horses warm things.
Correct.
And yeah, it probably does smell nice when you put warm water on it and what have you. So just take your horse's normal, whatever you feed them, balancer, alfalfa pellets, senior feed, whatever it is, and put warm water on it. There are actually, a number of mash products out there now on the market. Again, I'm still not really a fan of just doing that randomly either, but just use your normal feed. Don't put screaming hot boiling water on, on it and then feed it to your horse. You do have to let it sit and settle and
because they will eat it and they will burn their mouth.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you see them kind of eating it going, kind of, you can't see the face I'm making, but kind of that, like, I want to eat it, but it's, and we've all burned ourselves on hot chocolate, and anybody that's done that knows how uncomfortable that is. So we don't want to do that. But, I would, the nutritionist in me is sitting here going, and if you put boiling water on your concentrate fortified feed, you're going to damage all your vitamins and omega-3s. But the reality is that's probably not why you're giving this meal at this moment in time is for that part of the nutrition package. And you're not going to be doing it every day, so it's probably not the end of the world. But yes, just put hot water on your normal feed.
Right.
I think we may have done that to death. Time to move on.
Okay, we're done with that. Let's just talk about feeding and cold weather. And I see some people say feed more grain, some say feed more hay, some say feed alfalfa. What are we feeding?
Yeah, I mean, it really, how's this? Depends on the horse. I feel like that's so often an answer I like to give. Generally speaking, right, so grains or your concentrate feeds, performance feeds, senior feeds type things, they're going to give your horse more calories per pound than a pound of hay will. But these feeds are generally also digested more efficiently than hay, and they're generally not relying so heavily on fermentation in the hindgut the way that hay is. And so hay is going to create more internal heat because it's going to need to be fermented by those bugs in the hindgut that, break down the hay. And so as part of that, fermentation processes are not very efficient. So you lose energy as heat. And so when we feed feeds that require microbial fermentation, we're actually helping the horse to kind of have like a little furnace, internal furnace in its gut. And so if your goal is to feed to help your horse stay warm, sort of from the inside out, then you're looking at feeding more hay in cold weather. If you are dealing with a horse that maybe is losing some weight, you're struggling to keep weight on it during the winter, and you need to get calories in it to kind of counteract the weight that it's lost and the calories it's burning for the cold weather, then there may be, that might be a time where you think, I need to increase the amount of concentrate feed that I'm feeding. But I'm always going to feed, you are going to increase the horse's calorie intake by feeding more hay as well. So feeding more hay is always going to be my kind of go-to first steps. And those harder keepers, they're probably getting concentrate feed already. You may find that your horse just won't eat any more hay. If you have a really hard keeper in the winter, or a senior with poor teeth, for example, they may be already maxed out on the amount of hay that they're willing to eat. And so then you may need to be feeding more, concentrate feed to those horses. But the general rule of thumb, if you have a happy, healthy horse just finds himself in some cold weather, your go-to should be feeding more hay.
I feed unlimited hay during the winter. I use slow feeders. One for the mess, because a lot of times they'll be stuck inside for longer periods of time because there's ice or snow or whatever the case is. And if it's on the ground, they're going to be stepping in it. It makes the stalls just much harder to muck. And then the second reason is it just lasts longer. So,
right.
They're going to be going, it's going to be cold, and it gives them something to do. They're going to move a little bit more eating out of the net, and then it's going to last through the night.
Yeah.
Is there an absolute temperature at which all horses are known to get cold? Having lived in the desert and in Canada, I feel like it really depends on where you are. And my mare in Arizona, she seemed to get cold at warmer temperatures than my pony here in Iowa.
Yeah, I know. I think you and I were talking, I think earlier this week, we were having that, what blanket are you putting on your horse this evening conversation. And I was saying it was, what was it here? Something like, 37. And my thoroughbred had a 150 gram fill blanket on. And your pony there in Iowa, where it was down, way down, 10 or something, and he was wearing a 150 gram fill blanket as well. So
he has a full body clip. It's 20 degrees in my barn, and he wears a 150 stable sheet. Yes,
whereas my thoroughbred is not clipped.
Correct.
Doesn't have much coat, but anyway, yeah. So to your point about absolute temperatures, so there's this thing called a lower critical temperature. Right. So this is when a horse is going to start to feel cold. So when an individual horse hits its lower critical temperature, it's going to feel cold. So studies have shown that for an average healthy horse, the lower critical temperature is around 32 degrees, 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Research has also shown that the lower critical temperature can vary both within a breed and between different breeds. So, for example, it's been indicated that pony breeds have a lower critical temperature of about 34.5 Fahrenheit to 51, and for thoroughbreds that range is 28 to 46. So that explains why we have the same blanket on a pony and a thoroughbred right there. And warm bloods, it's different again. So, and that was some work done by David Marlin. So this might come as a surprise, but it's much easier to lose heat when your body is small, because your relative surface area is greater. So sometimes it can be a matter of how big your horse is. Like a mini is potentially going to struggle to keep warm versus, a big warm blood, just because that mini's relative surface area is greater. It's losing more heat relative to its size than a big warm blood or draft breed. So smaller animals have an advantage in warmer climates and big horses have an advantage in colder ones. So the critical temperature can also vary based upon the horse's condition, right? Their age. We know that senior, obviously very old horses don't regulate their temperature as well. Interestingly, young horses also don't regulate their temperature very well. So, kind of weanlings, yearlings, they don't have, hopefully, a ton of body fat on them. And so they're not going to regulate their temperature quite as well either. Mature horses that are unclipped and have thick coats and are accustomed to the cold weather, they may have a critical temperature as low as 5 degrees Fahrenheit. It's also been, shown that the lower critical temperature can change during the winter period. So once the horse is acclimated, and this really goes for weather acclimation in general, the same is true for heat. Once a horse is acclimated to cold weather, their ability to handle that cold weather gets better. Right. So they're going to, I think we all intuitively know this, right? That I find myself putting my horses feel colder in, say, November and might get that, say 150 gram fill blanket put on at a temperature that when it comes to January, they'd only have a sheet on for that temperature because they're just used to being in the colder weather more. So there's so many factors that go into it. That's a very long way of saying that no, there's no when your horse gets to this temperature, it's going to be cold. It depends on so many factors and the individual horse.
So how do I know what my horse's lower critical temperature is?
Yeah, this really comes from experience, right, with your horse, paying attention to your horse, knowing your horse. So, for example, does he normally keep condition on well in the winter despite cold temperatures in your area? Then your horse's lower critical temperature may be on the lower end of the scale. However, if your horse is new to you or you recently moved to a new area, then you may need to use, kind of higher values as a starting point and then monitor over the winter and just pay attention to kind of how they do.
How do I use this to inform my feeding decisions?
Yeah, so it's thought, so kind of going back to the, feeding more hay thing, it's thought that about 15 to 20% more calories per day will be needed for every 10 degree Fahrenheit drop below the horse's lower critical temperature. So for an 1,100 pound horse, let's say it needs 16 megacalories per day, day to day, this would increase that requirement by about 2.5 to 3.5 megacalories per day, for every 10 degree drop in temperature. So that's about 2 to 3 pounds of good quality grass hay, because grass hay is just a little bit, less than 1 megacalorie per pound if it's good quality. So for every 10 degree Fahrenheit drop in temperature below freezing, you're going to increase your hay intake by 2 to 3 pounds. And obviously this amount would keep changing as the weather does, and it's not uncommon to start with feeding a few pounds more at the start of the winter, and by the end, you've increased it substantially. And then the average horse needs, it's important to keep in mind that you need to be making sure that you're feeding at least 1.5% of the horse's body weight in forage per day all year round. And in winter, that might increase to the fact that you're feeding more like 2.5% of body weight per day, as you're adding more hay in there. So, and hay is something, because, as we talked about earlier, about not making big changes, because hay is something that they get every day already, it's safe to just be like, I'm going to feed you 3 or 4 extra pounds today, and I'm not going to do that tomorrow. You can kind of, depending on what the weather does, you can make that sudden increase in hay, as long as it's hay they've already been eating every day.
So I don't want to get into the great debate of whether you should blanket your horse or not, but
Yeah.
But can you share how blankets might help some horses in the winter?
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward, really, right? They provide insulation. They help keep horses warm. And so I just alluded to the fact that, for every 10 degree drop below that, say 32 degrees, they're burning 2 to 3 extra megacalories per day. If they're getting cold, they have to burn calories to keep warm. And if they are correctly blanketed, then they're not going to have to burn those calories to keep warm. So, especially those people that have harder keepers, you'll find you don't have to feed so many groceries if you correctly blanket that horse. You're going to help that horse, put those calories towards maintaining its body weight rather than towards keeping itself warm. I think it's worth throwing out there. Conversely, if you have an overweight horse, you can use the winter time to help them lose some weight because, if they have to stand out and burn some calories to keep warm, that's calories that's not going into making body fat. So, that's why horses in the wild go through these ebbs and flows of condition, and they lose weight in the winter, and then the pasture comes in the spring and they gain the weight back and they go through these ebbs and flows. We're not very good at letting our horses do that. We like to keep them all the same all the year. And if we're totally honest, they often gradually creep up and get heavier and heavier, and we perhaps don't notice. Refer people back to our last couple of episodes about how to do body condition scoring and weight estimation and a diet audit. But yeah, so blankets definitely have their place. And I think there's so much good information out there now about making blanketing decisions. And I do think that historically we over blanketed. Gosh, I think of all the blankets we piled on my poor horse in high school. I mean, he was he was like 6 inches thick in blankets. And, my tendency now is to kind of check myself and put on something a little lighter than I might have done in the past. But certainly for clipped horses, if it's windy, we had a lot of wind the last 2 days. My horses had slightly, they actually had a sheet on all day 2 days ago. It was 55 degrees, but the wind was making it feel like upper 30s. And that's just, they don't have a solid wall to kind of back up against as a windbreak. So right. I felt like they benefited from having that on. So it really just does depend on the horse and the situation.
There's definitely a big difference between when it's wet and cold and when it's cold and dry. So if you have a horse that gets wet and it is cold outside, and Texas last night, shout out to everybody in Texas that's dealing with the rain and the cold, because I think they're getting like 36 hours of rain and it's in the 30s. And I mean, that's a miserable temperature for horses that are just not used to it. So if you choose not to blanket, there is a possibility your horse could get colder depending on their condition, because all of their hair is flat against their body, as opposed to if they're dry and they can poof it up. You've all seen, we can all picture the cute little pony. I have one.
Right.
That, he's a yak, and he just like, you look out when it's cold and he's like, all of his hair is standing up and he's just like a teddy bear. He's so cute. So that's something to keep. I mean, maybe you're not blanketing because you think the horse is cold. Maybe you just need to try to keep him dry. And that's okay too.
I think it's really interesting. I went back to England over Christmas, and I live on the edge of Dartmoor. I grew up on the edge of Dartmoor National Park, and there are wild ponies in there. And we had some rain overnight, and we were walking. And maybe we'll post this picture on the social media. But I actually have a close up of it. So the coat was wet and it's long, and you can see how all the hairs have come together in a little point, and so all the water is running off that hair. And obviously, I couldn't get my hand on it. It's a part of a wild pony. People always say, are they really wild? You got within 5 feet of it. They're used to seeing a lot of people, but I'm certainly not going to be, checking out whether its skin's dry. But I suspect its skin was dry. I mean, it had a really thick coat, and those outer hairs are designed to, for the water to run off and direct the water away from the skin. And it does a really good job on an unclipped horse. They really keep horses dry. But if you've got driving rain, or once their skin gets wet, it's a whole different story.
Well, and I think the other thing is, not everybody knows this. If you see a horse standing outside in the snow and it has a blanket of snow on its back, or it's building up, maybe there's a couple inches on its back, that horse is warm. It's not cold.
Yeah, it's so counterintuitive.
Warm. So same thing, though. If you've got two horses standing there and one has an inch of snow sitting on its back and the other one has no snow on its back, the one without the snow on its back, you need to be checking it and seeing if it's cold. So, Claire, you want to talk about the science there?
Yeah, I mean, that's the hair, right? Like I was just talking about that thick layer of hair. If you have that horse, I mean, so probably, I'm guessing your pony, this probably happens to you. You have, your little pony who doesn't get all the mod cons of blankets and things and just has a very fluffy coat. A huge amount of air gets trapped in that coat and creates an amazing layer of insulation. And so that's actually, when that insulation layer is there, it's actually sort of preventing the body heat from escaping the horse, and therefore the snow is not going to melt because
Right.
it's not being influenced by the heat from the horse's body, versus a horse that doesn't have a very good coat, or that coat that's got wet all the way through. Now that body heat's just leaving, right? It's just, evaporation, and it's and what have you, and it's just going to melt the snow. So to your point, yes, horses and cattle too that have snow on them are actually warm. And we can create that. Like, I mean, if you do get to the barn, I mean, I've definitely had this happen. You get out there after work or whatever, and the horses, you misjudge the weather. You turn them out without blankets on, and they got wet and they're cold, and you get there and they're cold and shivery or whatever. You need to get them warmed up. You can do what's called thatching. So if you have, ideally you do this with kind of a lightweight, like a cooler type sheet, but you throw that on and then you stuff straw or hay underneath it. That straw or hay creates air layers between the horse and the blanket, and creates a layer of warmth and helps dry that horse out. And we used to have, I don't know if you had them in Canada growing up, what we call jute rugs or blankets that are made out of like Hessian sacking.
Yes.
And they were amazing. And then a wool lining. So we'd put on literally like our string cooler, like the string,
That you can't find anymore.
No.
Yes.
And then you'd throw your straw underneath your string cooler and throw your jute rug on. And the reason why the jute rugs were so good was because they were all natural fiber. The air would pass out, the moisture would pass out through them. The same if you could throw a wool cooler over the top, because wool does the same thing. Like we've all seen the wool coolers that have like a dew on top of them because the heat's coming up through and creating a dew. But that's really important. You want to make sure if your horse is wet and you do thatch them, you want to try and put up a top blanket on that's actually breathable. You don't want to be trapping all that moisture underneath. It needs to be. So ideally, you're not putting on a waterproof sheet over the top of that if you're doing that.
You can also do that if you ride, if your horse is not clipped, if they get sweaty, same thing. I mean, put the cooler on, put that in there. If you use hay, as they dry, the hay will fall out. The horses eat the hay. It's a win-win. It's like their own slow feeder in their blanket.
I would say straw works a little better if you have straw, but not many people have straw around so much anymore. And I'm not a huge fan of straw bedding. So that's a whole different topic for airway health purposes. But you're going to have hay around. So hay's good. And, again, if your horse is really cold, putting some standing wraps on can really help too, because they don't always have great circulation in their legs, right? And they don't have any muscles below the knees and hocks to kind of help with insulation and things. So if you've got a really cold horse, putting them in standing wraps for a bit, but do make sure you take those wraps off and check them and re-wrap frequently. Don't just put wraps on and leave them on forever. Seen that done before, and that's just a disaster waiting to happen.
Well, back in 2021, when I was living in Colorado and I came down to see you in Arizona, and I brought Dash with me and we were down there, he had lost quite a bit of weight traveling. As we know, he doesn't travel well. And he had a clip for the show when we were down in Arizona, and we came back and we had that big storm, and he normally runs really hot. And it's the only time I've ever seen him shiver. And I ended up putting the wool cooler with the neck cover on, a 250-gram blanket, and a 300-gram. And I ended up putting standing wraps on him. And it still took about an hour to get him to stop shivering. He had unlimited hay, and he was just so cold. And, as a comparison, like right now, it's, 20 degrees outside, and he's wearing a 180. So, and he's got a full clip. But, you need to be checking. Different things can happen that your horse might normally, he's warm or he's fine. And, you could go to a show, he could be clipped. He might not be feeling well, whatever. So, checking on them. Don't just assume that they're going to be fine because they were fine last storm.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have a picture of him dressed like that? I seem to remember seeing one.
I do. I have the picture. I think it's from the back, and you can see like all the layers and the standing. I mean, I felt terrible. I felt so bad because I've never seen him shiver before. And he's the type that stands out in the snow all the time. And yeah, it was a bit worrisome. I do
He's
have a
like you. He's
picture.
Canadian born and bred.
He is. He's from Alberta. He likes the cold. He didn't like it then.
Yeah, for sure.
So we have a whole episode on enrichment and slow feeders that listeners can check out, but this is a great time to use them. Like if your horse is turned out and it's cold, putting your hay in different areas so that they have to move around and walk a little bit, it'll help keep them warm, but it keeps them from getting stiff. The joints are moving. And if they're in their stall, they might be stuck inside for a few days, depending, on what your weather's doing. So can you put up 2 hay nets, or can you use a hay ball or the hay play, so they are moving even in their stall? They can go from, to 2 different feed stations. Like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. It's not just for, like, to your point of them, it's important for joint health, especially in our senior horses. It's like people with any of our listeners who have any arthritis will know that cold weather, especially cold, wet weather, really, really can make your joints uncomfortable. And motion is lotion. So, getting those joints moving is my vet shared that with me. I thought it was quite good. So that's important for joint health, but it's also really good for digestive tract function, right? So one of the reasons why we get more colic in the winter is that horses are shut up and not moving as much, and movement, walking, moving really helps keep feed moving through the digestive tract. So it's good colic, prevention and warmth. Right. I mean, I don't live in a particularly cold place, but I sit in my office in front of my computer for hours at a time most days. And it's funny, I'll be sitting here in a sweater and a vest. And, at the end of the afternoon, I get up to go out to the barn to ride, like, a little after 5. And it might be 65 degrees outside here, for example. Like today, I'm looking outside, blue sky, sunny. It's probably about that right now. And I get outside, my hands are cold. Actually, my daughter held my hand yesterday in the car and she's like, "You're freezing." And I'm like, "I know." And I walk outside and I'm like, "This is ridiculous. It's so warm outside." And I've got all these clothes on. But it's because I've been sitting and my metabolic rate has dropped. And so I feel cold, even though, my house is not cold. It's not cold outside. So the same for your horses, like having them moving and just walking around a little bit is going to help keep them warm. So yeah, multiple reasons to try to keep horses moving in the cold weather.
Here's another non-Arizona thing that you would never have to do, but it is fun. If you have to move your hay in the winter, if you're taking your hay out to put it out in the paddocks for turnout, going to the dollar store to Walmart and getting one of those cheap plastic sleds with the rope handle, and you can stack all your nets or stack all your hay on there and drag it out. It is so much easier to drag your hay on the sled than to try to push the wheelbarrow out or to try to use anything that's got wheels.
That's a great idea. And then if it's uphill on the way out, you can ride it back to the barn at the end.
Correct. If you'd like to go sledding after your chores, you can do that too.
That's awesome. I love it.
I know when it's cold, the last thing we want to think about is having the vet out and hoping that we don't have to have the vet out. But can we talk about vitamin E? Like, how does it affect the muscles in the winter, and why is it a good time to test?
Absolutely. Your vet is probably hoping you don't call them out too. Let's be honest.
That is correct.
Yeah, they're wanting to sit at home in the warm as well. So vitamin E, I think we have an episode on vitamin E where we go into it in a lot of depth. Do we? Have we not done one on vitamin E? If we haven't done one on vitamin E, we
absolutely.
should.
No, we do have an episode on vitamin E.
I thought so. Yeah. I was like, anyway, so vitamin E is very abundant in fresh pasture, but it doesn't survive hay curing very well. And so obviously at this time of year, it really doesn't matter kind of where you are, whether in the country, whether you're seeing snow and ice and whatever or not. If you're in Florida or Arizona, most horses at this time of year are getting their diet at least supplemented with some amount of hay, which means that they're likely not getting enough vitamin E off any pasture they may be having access to. And certainly if they're on straight, hay and no pasture, then they really aren't getting any vitamin E from that. And hopefully the feeds that you're feeding, have enough vitamin E in them to meet the horse's requirements. But we know that how horses metabolize vitamin E is very individual horse to horse. So, I can put together a diet and, provide 100, 150% of the NRC requirement, and that horse might actually test as being deficient. And that's more likely to be an issue for those horses that have pasture in the summer, this is more likely to be an issue in the winter when they're always on hay. So to your point about why it's a good time of year to test, it is a good time of year to test to see whether or not your hay-based diet is actually providing your horse enough vitamin E, or whether maybe you need more. And, for those of us in places like Arizona where we're feeding hay year round, that's going to tell me whether or not my diet, period, is providing enough vitamin E. For someone like, such as yourself, where you have pasture in the summer and hay in the winter, it's going to tell you whether your winter diet is providing enough vitamin E. So it is really important for muscle health. It helps, with muscle sort of suppleness and exercise recovery and that kind of thing. So yeah, horses that don't have enough vitamin E, do struggle with some muscle soreness. And if you are working your horse this winter, and they're vitamin E deficient, they may struggle with their recovery and that kind of thing. So yeah, vitamin E is definitely something to think about year round, but especially in the winter.
That's all the time we have. So before we go, what do you want listeners to take away from this conversation?
Oh, well, a couple of things that we haven't talked about that are really important. First of all, salt. I did not plug salt. And anybody that knows me knows I love to talk about salt. Salt's really important for hydration. It is like the cheapest colic insurance you can get for your horse. And many people rely on a block, and many people's horses don't really use a block very well. So I love to provide just a plain salt block, but I also really like to put salt in their feed. And, there's a rule of thumb is 1 tablespoon of salt per 500 pounds of body weight, and that will give your horse their daily maintenance sodium requirement when they're idle and doing no work and the weather's cool. And by keeping their sodium intake up, it's like you eating chips, they're going to want to go and drink something shortly thereafter. So it's a great way of maintaining kind of thirst drive. And then the other part of that, of the sort of hydration thing, my two things kind of go together, is monitoring your manure, not your manure output, your horse's manure output. You can monitor your own manure output if you like, but monitoring your horses.
Yeah.
Talking about the horses. Manure consistency, making sure you're getting enough, manure, again, with them standing in, not moving, colic and things, and having a drier diet with it being hay-based, maybe not drinking as much because the water's cold, knowing, and I think what's really important, knowing what is normal for your horse, right? Because your horse,
absolutely,
Dash probably doesn't make the same number of manure bowls as, Dartmouth does, for example. So,
no.
Saying, I need 8 piles of manure a day, it doesn't really, it's what's normal for your horse. So knowing, and I appreciate if you board, that's a challenge, right? Because, you get there and there's no manure in the stall, and then you're like, is that because he didn't poop or because he just got mucked out? So, just casually chatting with your barn owner, during cold spells and just saying, hey, is my horse's manure normal right now? Helping them to think about it can be a good idea. And again, demeanor, right? How are they, do they seem their normal happy self, right? Or are they starting to be a bit grumpy about being in, and we may be getting a bit ulcery because we're, stuck in and routines changed and we, all those kinds of things.
I have one thing to add before we go. At the time of this recording, we are watching the devastating fires in California.
Yeah.
If your barn does not have an evacuation plan in place, now is the time to make one. It might be a fire, it might be a hurricane, it could be flooding, but you need to have a plan. So take advantage of this cold weather and not riding, and have a barn meeting and come up with a plan. There's a lot of great resources online that can help you get started. You can call your fire marshal and they will come into your barn and do a talk for you. But don't just rely and hope that your barn has a plan. You need to be a part of it.
Yeah, and I think that's something very personal to you, right? Because you help on a number of sort of disaster resource pages, helping people find places to go and evacuate to in Colorado. And you've watched this for a number of years now and kind of been a little bit on the front lines. And I know when I lived in Northern California, we had the big fires in the Sonoma Napa area, and I, personally had friends affected by it, and it's devastating. Like, waiting until it happens to you is too late.
That's right. If there's smoke in the air, it's too late. Like, you have to have a plan. Your horses need to be able to get in the trailer. You have to know where you're going. You have to, if you don't have a trailer, you need to know who's coming to get you. But I could talk about that for a whole episode, and maybe
I think we
will.
will. And I think we will. I think it's because so many people in the US and overseas, I mean, especially wildfires, right? I mean, we see wildfires now in Mediterranean and Europe. Australia gets hit by devastating fires. So, a lot of our listeners around the world are also impacted by various natural disasters, unfortunately. So, yeah, we'll definitely put that on our list of episodes for the future.
For our listeners, if you'd like to be a part of our conversation, please send your suggestions for future topics and equine nutrition questions to info@scoopandscale.com, and is spelled out. You can also find Claire at clarityequine.com.
If you've enjoyed this episode, we'd be thrilled if you'd share it with your friends on social media. That really helps us out. To share an episode is a huge compliment, and we really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform.
For the Scoop and Scale podcast, I'm Jill Jackson.
And I'm Dr. Claire Tunis.
Thanks for riding along with us.